Hi, this is Paul, and this is I don't know, Ash. How do you want to introduce yourself?
Well, let's see. My name is Ashod to my aunts, and the reason I go by Ash is because nobody can say Ashod properly. Uh, I get all kinds of variations, but never quite the right one. So Ash it is. I am someone who has moved a lot. I live in the U.S. now, but I was born and raised in Egypt, in Cairo, Egypt, and the reason I was born and raised in Cairo, Egypt, is because of the Armenian Genocide. My great-grandparents immigrated there on both sides of my family from Armenia, fleeing, well, actually, what is now Turkey, fleeing the Armenian genocide. And there's a lot that happened, but I think it's important to start there. And as a matter of fact, if you look at this picture right there, this is my oldest surviving ancestors that were the picture was taken right before 1915. They both passed there. They were massacred, and my family lineage doesn't go any further back than that. And so I'm always interested in people's stories, and I really want to learn about, what makes people tick and what their ancestry has to do with how they act in life now, because I don't have that background. So it's always made me really curious about history, as you can tell from the pictures behind me. And so I moved to the US about 20,
Well, why don't you back up?
22
Because
years
probably
ago.
not everybody knows where Armenia is. They might have heard about the genocide. For many
Sure.
Americans, that would be the only reference. So why don't you give a little bit of
Yeah.
geography and history? Some will know Burn Power, who is in
Yeah,
Georgia. But
that's right. So Bern Power is in Georgia, and Armenia is the country right to the south of Georgia. I Armenia is a very small country now. There's only a couple million people that live there. It's surrounded by Azerbaijan to the east and Iran to the south and Turkey to the west. But historically, Armenian lands encompassed a much larger region and was always sort of in the midst of turmoil and split between massive powers on either side. So on the eastern side, it would have been Iranian, Sassanid, Persian, and on the western side, it would have been Greek, Roman, Byzantine, and so on. So constant battles, constant heartache. I mean, just, and really, I think I think that history is really important for what Christians are going through in the West now. So I'll probably get into that more later. But what happened was Ottoman Turkey became a massive superpower and encompassed a very large region, all of Turkey, all the way into Armenia, a portion of Iran, and into, of course, the Saudi Arabian region and North Africa, basically. And they were a very strong, powerful dynasty for 300-400 years, until eventually what happened with modernity, the Young Turks took power. And of course, it started off as, this is going to be a great reform, we're going to become European, and it very quickly turned into uh, being separated along ethnic lines and massacres, and something that a lot of people don't appreciate about the Armenian genocide is that if someone knows about the Armenian genocide, they know that it was in 1915. But actually, the massacres and the entire genocide took a very long period of time, from the late 1800s all the way to 1922, 1920s, let's say. So a very horrible, long, bloody period that was an absolute mess. My great grandfather left Armenia in the area of Severeg, which is sort of at the border between Syria and Turkey today. He left that area in 1914, went to Cairo and started a grocery store. He only managed to live for a couple years before he died, leaving behind a wife and 4 kids. My grandfather was the third oldest, and he was only 3 years old. And his shortly after, his mom passed away, and so he's left an orphan. And what happened was the youngest son was adopted by a family, but the rest were sort of, in different orphanages. And my grandfather happened to be living in a hospital, actually, with a bunch of Anglican nuns, nurses, until he was 11 years old. And then his aunt, who also fled Armenia through Greece, eventually made it down to Egypt and collected all the children together in one house. And then he went to school for a few days, had a normal childhood for a couple of years, I should say. And then when he was 13, he went to the metalworks factory and worked there because he had to support the family. So very little schooling and a lot of work early on. Eventually, he became really good, really proficient, was a skilled craftsman in metalworks, and finally was able to be a foreman and teach others. These are all Egyptian people. He's teaching them, and then eventually finally purchases the business from the person who owned it before him. It was a Greek person. So very horrible, horrible childhood. And the thing about my grandfather is that, he was an absolute orphan, very poor, but he never had the attitude of hating God or, being atheist or anti-God or, how did God do this? And it's surprising to me how much people can go through suffering and still hold on to their, respect and adoration and admiration of God. But people who have a pretty nice life can, for a very small thing, can just kind of throw it all away and say, this God's horrible God. Find it really bizarre.
Let's pull back a little bit. So you've got at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, you've got sort of the slow motion erosion of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is kind of shrinking. By the First World War, it was called the sick man of Europe. You're also in a colonial period. Well, who were the Armenian people? Why were they different from the people from, let's say, whoever was hunting them down? What were their motivations? And I think it's helpful because today, when you say flee to Egypt, people's conceptualization of Egypt today is probably, that's one of those Muslim countries in the Middle East. But of course, in 1915, in terms of the map, Egypt was a very different place up until obviously the decolonialization that happens after the Second World War, because of course with Egypt you're going to have Nasser, and I mean all of these nations in the last 150 years have been going through a lot of transition and a lot of, see, this is where nomenclature is different. Nationalities, because when we talk about a nationality, Americans often sort of think of a nation state, but when we're talking, let's say, when you use the term genocide or Armenian people, you're talking about really an ethno-religious heritage that kind of goes through time. And so then when people become refugees to another place, in a sense, they take their religious heritage with them to this other place. But of course, the Egypt that we conceptualize today in 2024 is very different from the Egypt of 1915. So maybe you should flesh that out a little bit too, because I think that helps people get an understanding of the story. And, now, of course, with Gaza and Israel, people just kind of look at these snapshots that are about this old, instead of seeing like, oh my goodness, this whole region of the world has been bloodshed and turmoil and lines. It's completely different over the last 100 years.
Sure. Okay, you are a history guy. All right, I'm trying to conserve.
I know
as
you're
much
trying
time
to
as
conserve, but we've got time. I've got 2 hours, so we can take our time with this.
All right, so
because I think these things are important, because otherwise people view these stories obviously through the only filters that they have, and adding a little bit more context can sort of open people's minds to, this stuff, this stuff is quite universal.
This is going to be fun. Okay, so Armenians are very, very proud about their Christian heritage. Let me start with that. So Armenia is the first Christian nation to adopt Christianity as the state religion. So Christian nationalism on steroids here. Okay, So 301 AD, okay, there's a very interesting story, what's the word for it? Historiography. I think it's where, like, you don't know if half of it is made up or half of it is real kind of history. And so there's very
Hagiography.
interesting hagiography, thank you. So there's very interesting history of there's a King Tertates, and he is sort of an independent king, but he's got relations with the Greeks, and he has this a problem of the Sassanids trying to take territory. So there's a lot of tension going on there. And then this guy, St. Gregory the Illuminator, shows up, and supposedly his father killed this king's father, but but nobody knows this. It's a very hush hush. And so this guy becomes Christian because his dad is now murdered. So he goes to this Greek, I think Syria somewhere, and he becomes Christian, and he becomes an evangelist, and he comes back to Armenia with his group of people, and he's evangelizing, and finally he's told to worship the idol for the king, and he's like, no, thank you. And they put him in this place called Horvirab. It's a hole in the ground, and I've been down in there a couple times, and it's, he lives there for 15 years, and this lady comes and drops, food for him, sort of like the raven, and then eventually the King Tertates goes mad. This should sound familiar to you, and he starts to act like a wild boar, and then the sister gets a vision, and then brings Gregory the Illuminator out of the hole and says, you need to take him to preach to the gospel to him. So he preaches to him, and he's finally converted, and he restores his faculties, and he says, okay, Jesus is my God now. And then they go through the process of Christianizing the whole area. And this is really fascinating, because what happens, this is really fast. So what happens is, you don't just, say, okay, we are going to start to have Bible studies, and we're going to have, we're going to start to have street corner evangelism. No. I'm sure that some of that was happening, but what you really do is you go to the priests of the temples, right? And you say, okay, so this is your land, because that's how it used to be done back in the day, that the family was the priest of this particular deity, and the entire lineage would continue to be priests. And so the king and of course, Gregory the Illuminator would go and say, okay, here's the deal. We can either kick you out and take this and convert it to a church, or you can convert to Christianity and start to have Christian services in this particular building. What do you think? So they of course, a lot of them start to convert to Christianity because they want to keep the business. They want to run the family, lot with the building, and we'll change the gods inside, and we'll be good to go. Everybody will be happy. And you start doing this, and all the, and then we're crafting identity now, and a Christian identity, and so we are separating ourselves away from the Zoroastrian religion, which is what the Sassanids were worshiping. And very early on, this is like 350 something, maybe 425. Yeah, 425 AD. What happens is the powerful king of the Sassanids comes and says to the Armenians, all right, listen, you guys are going to have to be Zoroastrians. Enough with this Christian stuff. And then there's a story written about how the Mamigonians, which is a clan, a certain warrior clan, says, no, this Christianity is part of our identity now. We can't do this. And so all the Zoroastrian priests that have been shipped over to, re-educate Armenians into the proper way of worship were famously kicked out, a lot of them after heavy beating. And there was a war, and Vartan Mamigonian was martyred in this war. And these people are willing to fight to defend their faith.
Yeah.
Very early religious war. And one of the things that really confuses me about the American Christianity type of thing is that we pretend that stuff like that never happens, that we never had to have a Christian war. And here's a very, very early one, 425 AD, and successive ones, by the way. It didn't just end with Vartan, one war and we're good to go. They actually lost that battle, but it was continual fighting for keeping the Armenian identity and also, very importantly, a Christian identity. And, you know, I mean, and this is a very serious history where the St. Gregory the Illuminator, his son, would have participated in the Nicene Council representing the Armenians. Okay, so, you know, we're talking some like serious heavy hitters here.
Yeah.
And there's a very interesting story of, you know, how the Armenian alphabet was invented or, you know, inspired and so on. And so there's a priest who's studying all these languages, and he's trying to create a language for Armenians and a written language for Armenians because, of course, they want to keep the scriptures and make the scriptures available to the Armenian people. Because what's the language used primarily? Greek.
Yep.
That's the language of the court. And so there's a story we learned as little kids in our Armenian school that, you know, the Mesrob Mashtots, that was his name. He had a dream, and in the dream, he saw the hand of God writing letters on the wall, and he woke up and he started copying those letters, and that's how we have the Armenian alphabet.
Well, and it's great that these are, I mean, this is what kids learn in school. I mean, this is I mean, in the Peugeot channel, they have this universal history series that they go, and this is the universal history of Armenia.
I can't wait for that one.
Yeah, this is well, maybe Jonathan will have to have you on to share the history of the Armenians. But this is, I mean, this is great because this is the identity. These are the people. The faith is integrated into it. This is who Armenians are. This is what it means to be this people.
Yes. So you are surrounded by, you know, pagan gods. You've got the Byzantine Christianity on the other side, and of course they're working through making Christianity more of part of the, you know, option of religions at that time. And you've got the councils and so on. And then let's fast forward to Chalcedon. So Chalcedon happens, and of course the Orthodox, you know, have that schism of the Oriental Orthodox, which so Armenia, the Egyptian, the Copts of Egypt, and the Ethiopians, and I think there's a few others, but those are the major players. They say, we don't really need to do the whole Chalcedonian thing. It's already been settled. And then, of course, the Constantinople, people in Constantinople and people in Rome say, no, we definitely need to do that. And you know, it's really interesting how the Coptic and the Armenian perspective of what happened is very different from the, you know, Eastern perspective, in just Eastern Orthodox perspective, and of course then the Western perspective. And what I find really interesting is that it's very easy for a lot of Protestant and, you know, evangelical and Eastern Orthodox, you know, writers to just dismiss the Chalcedonian kind of schism as sort of like, a bunch of heretics. But when you really look into it and you look at the history from the Armenian perspective, there's a lot of evidence that a lot of the people who agreed with Chalcedon and the people who rejected Chalcedon still share the same monastery for like 50, 60, 100 years after. And we have a very interesting history of having a Byzantian king who, what was famous back then was chariot racing. So they were done with the gladiator stuff, but they were still doing the chariot races. And how there was a team that was very good that was Chalcedonian, and there was another team that was not very good that was, also very good, but rivals that were a different color. One was blue, one was green. I don't remember the colors. And what happened was the emperor really liked the blue team, didn't like the green team, and the blue team happened to be the Chalcedonians, not the anti. So therefore, all right, we're going to have to, you know, get rid of the silly Lakers out of here, and, you know, and so on. So fascinating, just fascinating perspective. And of course, there's a lot of work in trying to, you know, restore that and recover relationships and so on. But it's an interesting topic that a lot of the people who are converting to Orthodoxy are not really talking about. And I've kind of find it fascinating that a lot of people are converting to different forms of Orthodoxy. Some are going Coptic, some are going, you know, and it's like, well, what about have you discussed Chalcedon? No, not really. I don't even know what the whole thing was about, you know, which is really fascinating. And so you have all of this happening. And of course, then finally, Islam shows up. And this is really important. When Islam shows up, what are the Christian nations that are most impacted by the rise of Islam? Turns out to be the anti-Chalcedonians.
Really?
Well, think about it.
Huh.
Where did Islam spread from, and where did it spread to? And the entire area, if I could, if this is sort of the Mediterranean Sea, that entire area to the east of the Mediterranean Sea, that was all, uh, you know, non-Chalcedonian Christians. And what happened was there was a lot of, historically speaking, there was a lot of persecution from the from the head of power in Byzantium and Constantinople. There was a lot of persecution against the anti-Chalcedonians and a lot of
Huh.
prejudice against them. And so they weren't getting, politically speaking, they weren't getting their fair share in Alexandria and in Armenia and those areas. And so they were like, maybe the Muslims will be nicer to us. And that's part of the reason why they let them in with open arms. And there was no
Huh.
major, initially there were no major wars against them. And when I was growing up in Egypt, we learned about the history of the opening of Islam, they call it in Arabic, and how Islam was accepted with open arms
Huh.
by the people that they invaded, and a lot of it has to do with the Chalcedon issue. So
Interesting.
that's an interesting part of history.
I've never heard any of this. This is fascinating.
So now you have an environment where you have Christians who are now living under the rule of Islam, and there's some interesting videos I can send you about the history of that, and how during the time of Islamic spread and when they first took over Jerusalem, finally the head of the Byzantine, the Pope, the Emperor of Byzantium, was actually an Armenian guy. Um,
Interesting.
oh yeah, oh yeah. And so he tries to fight them off, but then he's dealing with all kinds of stuff, the Balkans and so on. So now we have an issue of Armenians who are Christians surrounded by Muslim entities and powers, and same thing with Christians in Egypt. And of course, you have this big pressure of, well, you can keep your religion, however, you have to pay us the jizya. It's the tax for
Right.
taking care of you for not being Muslim. But if you convert to Islam, you don't have to pay that anymore. And so if you're poor, you kind of didn't have
Everybody
much.
likes a tax break. It seems like
Right.
an easy thing if you're not all that invested.
Exactly. So it was a very interesting time, and very interesting writing about, well, how do you maintain your Christian identity while also being under the rule of a foreign, a different God? And is it a different God? Is it not a different God? Are we worshiping the same God or are we not? All those questions. It's been going on for 1400 years.
Yeah.
And so you've got Armenians living in the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire, eventually, when finally they kind of take over, covers a really large area, like I said, geographically speaking. And as like you said, the Ottoman Empire is sort of, becoming weaker politically and militarily, what happens is a lot of those Islamic nations start to form their own sort of separate, powers.
Yep.
And not many of it had actually much to do with ethnicity, of like, we are Egyptian, so to speak. So, for instance, Egypt seceded from the Ottoman Empire, ruled by a ruler. His name was Muhammad Ali, and he was from Turkey. He was an Egyptian. And so he says, you know what? I don't really want to have to pay tax to the big guy in
Right.
Istanbul. I'm just going to say, I'm on my own.
Yep.
I don't have to pay you. I don't think you can hurt me. And that's basically what happened.
That's a very old story. I mean, in terms
Yeah.
of the imperial vassal arrangement, that's the constant. I mean, you read about it in sort of the end of the Judean kingdom. I mean, it's all about, we're sick of paying the tribute, so we're going to stop paying tribute. Then we'll see if he comes down, if he can muster it. I mean, that's just the name of the game for the imperial vassal relationship.
Exactly. And so when you're a smaller power, you pit the big powers against each other, and you try to take the best deal you can from either sides, which can be helpful for you in the short term, but then the long term can create a lot of problems.
Yep.
And so eventually what happens is that a lot of Armenians were in Egypt at the time, and as a matter of fact, the prime minister of Egypt at the time of Muhammad Ali's reign was Armenian. And so Armenians were primarily craftsmen involved in building all kinds of things. And one of the things they're very famous for building are actually mosques. If you go to Egypt today, you will see a lot of mosques built by, and they have the plaques with the name, an IAN ending, an Armenian guy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and the fruit mandarins.
yeah.
Okay, so this is something Armenians like to say. Like Armenians always will tell you, like, here are all the wonderful inventions and how Armenians are the root of all of them. So so basically, the fruit, the mandarin, came from India to Egypt, and the person who brought that fruit to Egypt was an Armenian guy who was the head of agricultural ministry at the time of Muhammad Ali's reign, and his name was Yusuf Effendi. Yusuf Effendi, Joseph Effendi. And so to this day, that fruit in Egypt is called Yust Effendi. Yeah, fun stuff like that.
Yep.
So then Armenians exist. They have a community from way before the Armenian genocide. Okay. But then,
and they even have a diaspora, because
there's
again,
a diaspora all over
right,
the Ottoman Empire. Yeah.
Because it's helpful to remember that part of what happens with empire is that one of the empire is a very interesting thing, because one of the things empire affords is, of course, diasporas. So, for example, we'll use biblical stories because a lot of people can recognize that. When the northern kingdom is destroyed by the Assyrians, people move out throughout the Assyrian Empire. Of course, the Assyrian Empire collapses. You have the Babylonians to replace them. The southern kingdom, Judea, the temple's destroyed. They spread out amongst the Babylonian Empire. And you have just empire after empire coming into this part of the world. And those empires mean that people can leave sort of their ethno-national homelands and begin to work in other places. That happens for the Jews, happens for the Armenians, happens for a great number of people, happens today. For example, you've got Russians, the Russian Empire, which is kind of the Soviet Union. You had Russians all throughout this empire. And of course, when the Soviet Union collapses and you have Russia again, then people have to figure out, do I go back? Do I stay? What's it going to be? I mean, these are very perennial stories.
And one of the weaknesses of this Ottoman system, and even all these small nationalities that are creeping up and seceding from the Ottoman Empire, what happens with the small villages and the small towns and the cities and such, there's no democratic process by which these people are ruled and governed. So what happens is, just like there's a vassal king, there's also a vassal head of the mayor, a vassal a governor, a vassal. Everybody's a vassal all down through the chain. And what happens is the king says, we need money for the war. I need money for a new jacuzzi. I need whatever.
Right.
And so then you just collect tax and keep some for yourself and send it up the chain.
It's tax farming. And to a certain degree, indulgences. I mean, people sometimes
same idea, right?
Gripe about they go to the Vatican and say, look at this beautiful building. You know what it cost them? Germany. Yeah. That's what the building cost.
Right. And so the villages that my ancestry are from, what happens is the rulers who were assigned were Kurds, were other Turkish people, were different ethnicities, and so what happens is, unfortunately, the Kurds are taking advantage. And by the way, if you're interested, there's a very interesting novel written in the late 1800s called The Fool by Rafi. Rafi is basically the Armenian Dostoevsky. Okay, he kind of captures the national kind of essence of what it means to be Armenian, and it's a very fascinating book. But he talks about how Armenians are suffering under the yoke of the Kurds and the Turks and the unfairness. And of course, he's getting ideas from the West about democracy and about modernity and so on. And he's saying, why isn't the church helping people develop? And why aren't the intellectual classes of Armenians helping the community, the villages, the small farming communities develop those rights and learn the technologies and learn the political systems so that they can govern themselves better, so they can have better representation, so that there's less injustice in the world. And unfortunately, the religious head, so in Armenia, there's a Catholicos, sort of like a pope, basically, and bishops, right? A very, very strong, Oriental Orthodox kind of structure, very similar to the Russian Orthodox or the Greek Orthodox. But all of those people were essentially just saying, oh, live in peace, it's okay, because there's what political power really is there to do anything. And part of where things started to go south for Armenians was actually when the Balkan states who were also part of the Ottoman Empire, started to talk about, I want to go independent. Let's talk about a Serbian identity. And then the Greeks also were part of the Ottoman Empire, and they want to talk about, Greek identity. And actually in the 1820s, ever since the 1820s, when John Quincy Adams was head of the State Department in the U.S., the Americans were, saying, hey, we got to help the Greeks. I mean, Seneca and all the people we like to read about, Cicero, we got to help these people. They want independence from Greece. And John Quincy Adams goes, I don't know. We shouldn't probably meddle in other people's affairs. Let them figure it out for themselves. So this goes way back. And of course, the Muslim Turkish community is very suspicious of any, Christian minorities who want to have more and more independence and more self-determination. And everything bubbles up until you have the Armenian Genocide, where they say, with World War I and with Russia being against the Ottoman Empire and the Young Turks, I guess at that point, Armenia is sort of in between us and Russia, and they're Christians and the Russians are Christians, so they probably might help each other. So, the best thing to do is just to eliminate the Armenian problem.
Now, when it comes to, let's say, a genocide, I mean, even though we have an understanding about total depravity, it is not a small thing to kill people, and it is not a small thing to kill people en masse. And I mean, part of what is remarkable about the 19th and the 20th century, although obviously these things were practiced earlier, I mean, you have rise of technology that make it via our machines. It's easier to kill people than it ever was. You don't need a knife. You don't need a sword. And maybe you can starve them by destroying their fields. I mean, there's lots of ways to subjugate and eliminate people. But so was it for the land? Was it just for the geopolitical? And then what was the methodology used? Obviously, I mean, even though most people, when they think about the Holocaust, think about the death camps, Timothy Snyder makes the point that the vast majority of Jews that were killed by the Nazis were shot. I mean, the bullet was the primary bullet, mass graves. I mean, this is what happened in Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and, that whole area. Well, what was the situation with the Armenian genocide? What did they armies? What did they do?
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So there's a lot of survivor accounts written of the Armenian genocide. You have one of them.
Yep. Right over there.
Yeah. There are a lot of survivor accounts written of the Armenian genocide. And generally what the consensus is, and the different stories that you hear of people who survived this hellish episode, what happens is again, remember the vassal powers, right? The head of the village or whatever would say, okay, the military needs young men to fight. There's war coming with Russia and with actually Turkey was with Germany, with Europe. And so we need to get young men to help with the military. So they would go to the heads of the village fathers, and they would go to the priests, and they would go to the leadership of the village, and it would say, bring us your young men between this age and that age. And of course, they would take them and have them work in mines, or have them work in, they wouldn't give them any guns. They would have them work in mines, or they would take them out of the town and just shoot them point blank. Wow. And then you only have the women and children and the old men and old women left. And so then they would tell them, okay, time for you to deport. We are going to, for safety, there's military coming, there's military stuff happening, so we need to get the civilians out of here for their safety and protection. Where are we going? Well, don't ask questions. And you start walking, and you walk for a long time, and there's an area called Der Zor. And if you are in Boston or ever go to Boston, or anybody listening goes to Boston, there's an Armenian museum in Boston, and there's a section where it depicts this awful state of Armenians just doing what they're told, being good citizens and respecting authority and saying, okay, we'll go. And of course, there were some young men who said, no, heck no. I know exactly what they're going to do. So word gets out. So they basically, go up to the mountains and protect themselves. And, when I say mountains, I mean more like hills. This is, of course, after all, plain country. Further east was where Armenia is today, is much more mountainous. than the plain country that my ancestry is from. And so they go up to the hills and they try to protect themselves in monasteries and so on and so forth. But in the, during this time, what's fascinating is that there's a lot of evangelism work going on from German Christians and from Americans. So in the Ottoman Empire, there are all these schools, all of these orphanages set up, because of course that culture doesn't have, foster child or taking family, it's you're on your own, kid. And so there's all these institutions that are built up. And of course, the book that you have talks about the struggle of how does an Armenian mission or an American missionary handle, going against the political power, but help the Armenian Christian that he just, helped baptize just 2 weeks before. How does all this work? And the fascinating dichotomy of trying to evangelize to people who are already Christians, maybe in name only, versus evangelizing to the Muslims. And so you're, because it's harder to evangelize to a Muslim person because it's you're not supposed to do it. But when it's easier to say, oh, these are my Christian brothers, I'm here for the Armenians.
Yeah.
So that's a fascinating, just whole fascinating thing. Anyway, so eventually what happens is, there are some revolts that happen. There are some political organizations that prop up to try to basically, fight against the Turks. But at this point, you've lost all ability to gather any, weaponry, any serious army, and so on. So a very small, very mountainous region of Armenia was able to be protected, and that's Armenia proper today. But that's a lot to do with topography, a lot to do with being close to Russia, and all of those issues. I hope I was better in my.
No, it was good. That was good. So let's get back to the personal history again. So your great grandfather goes to Egypt. Did I get the right number of greats in there? Okay,
that's correct. My great grandfather goes to Egypt.
So they see what's going on with all of this stuff, and it's like, we got to get out of here. So they get out of there. He dies young. Then suddenly, of course, all 3 of my 4 grandparents, all of whom were born in America, just barely born in America. I mean, they didn't have more than 8th grade education, because at 8th grade, it's right into the mills and start working right away.
Yeah, similar. Yeah. And so, and why Egypt? Because it was all they could do. A lot of Armenians ended up in Lebanon. Lebanon took a lot of Armenians. I mean, there's maybe even to this day, there's over several 100,000 Armenians in Lebanon, and a lot of them, are able to hold political power and be representatives in Congress and in their parliament. So Syria also took in a lot of Armenians, and Egypt not as much, of course, because of just distance. Jerusalem, there's an Armenian quarter in Jerusalem, and this goes way back, has nothing to do with the Armenian genocide, way back. But again, that's a small piece of land, relatively speaking. And a lot of Armenians ended up in France. A lot of Armenians ended up in the US, in Australia, Canada, just anywhere they could go. And for a lot of Armenians, Egypt was never the final destination. It was always just a pit stop until further west. It just so happened that because my grandfather was an orphan, he didn't have the family relationships and the context to be able to keep going. And he made a life for himself. He was fairly successful fairly early on. Now, one of the things that he did, which in this corner of the internet, when we talk about meaning and finding meaning in life, one of the things that he did is really interesting. When he was in his late 20s, just established as a business owner, let's say, he chooses to build a mausoleum for the Armenian community, so that if anybody is poor and doesn't have any burial site to bury their families, they could use the mausoleum that he dedicated to the church and for the poor people of Armenians living in Egypt, because he doesn't know where his mom and dad are buried. They're poor, probably a mass grave somewhere. And so that always bothered him, and he wanted to make sure that others had the opportunity to visit their loved ones. And the other thing that he did was, when he was an orphan, he was barefoot for most of the time, and he was always embarrassed by that, even as a little kid. And so every year he would give to all the Armenian children in the community, that he would give them shoes.
Wow.
and,
Wow.
and he would buy shoes every year. And this is the time of now again, Egypt is going through a lot of change.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, there's the kingdom, the Egyptian kingdom is falling. There's the revolution with Nasser, as you
Yeah.
said, taking over, and
Yeah.
Egypt is all of a sudden, leaving the West and siding more with Russia. And so, of course, when you're siding with Russia, you don't really get a lot of stuff from them. So there, import export problems, and there's just nothing in Egypt. So it's very difficult to be generous at this time. And
Yeah.
it was a way for him to gain some status,
Yeah.
perhaps.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
want to. I don't. I mean, he doesn't. He seems like a really nice guy, and I don't want to say that he only did it for the sake of trying to get some, fame and be like something significant in the community. But I mean, there is something to,
Yeah.
generosity will get you some
Luke,
name recognition.
Luke 16, as a recent Randos conversation reminded
Yes,
me, use worldly wealth to gain friends. It's right there in Luke 16.
right.
Little wisdom nugget from Jesus.
That's right. But the thing about that environment that I grew up in is that everybody assumes that they are Christian because they are Armenian.
Okay, let's locate this. What you're talking, so you're younger than I am. So you're growing up in the 80s, 90s?
81 is
81.
what I was. Mhm.
Okay, so one year I graduated high school. This is getting serious now. So yeah, so you've got Nasser, you've got I mean Egypt. There's a lot of interesting history that people will know a little bit more of now in
Yeah,
terms of it's post-colonial. You have the Suez Crisis, where the United States basically tells England and France to back off.
right.
And so Egypt, and Egypt is again in this is during the Cold War. You've got these countries that are sort of playing this one side off against the other. If we side with the Soviet Union, we can get some military and stuff. And so you've got, wars with Israel back and forth. And you're growing up, with all of this stuff. Then eventually there's going to be in the 80s, then there's going to be this peace under Arafat. But remember, Arafat is not Arafat. It's
Sadat.
yeah. And
But then he dies very quickly.
right, he
But
dies.
Mubarak takes over. Yeah.
Yes. And Mubarak is sort of he's a dictator, but part of the thing that people don't understand in that part of the world is it might be a dictator, but if it's less chaotic, a lot of people will go for that bargain. Oh, if as long as they're not repressing me too bad, people will often opt for order rather than chaos, or at least order rather than bloodshed. So you've got Mubarak, he's in power, and but you've also got sort of the rise of Islamism that's going on throughout the Arab world as well. In Egypt, a lot of these dictators are just kind of keep a lid on that because they don't want to see what happened in Iran. What happened to the Shah, they don't want to see that happen to them.
Well, I think Egyptians were going through their own meaning crisis as well. I think that had a lot to do with the rise of Islamism, because I think in the, Egyptian cinema rivaled Hollywood. It was the sec for a while in the 40s to 60s, in that era. Egyptian cinema was like neck and neck with Hollywood as far as quality of production. This is back in like black and white movies, and just amazing actors, just real quality work, real artists. But then what happened was, with nationalization, with the whole like more socialist kind of move, all of those frivolous things, and of course all the drain that happened of, people who were wealthy, people with means, decided to leave. I don't want this headache. And so a lot of the talent left. A great example, Omar Sharif.
Yeah.
That famous actor. So that's an example of someone who said, "Thanks, I think I'm heading out of here." Uh, and I think what happened was Egyptians were kind of looking for. What's interesting growing up in Egypt is that you always look at everything around you in Egypt was more glorious in the past than it is today.
Oh,
Which is a very weird kind of way to grow up, where
yeah.
you look at the mosques and you're like, yeah, that mosque was built, 1,000 years ago. Look how glorious it must have been, and look what state it is in today. Look at the pyramids. Look at all the ancient, ancient Egyptian stuff. Everything is just so glorious, and they like to call Egypt the cradle of civilization. The place where it all started, and all. But then look at everything around you, and everything's a mess, and pollution, and everything's crowded and dirty, and just it's not pleasant to live in, really, honestly, unless you're super wealthy. And they just always look at the past as like that's proof of our significance, and not just the past as in like 2 weeks ago. The past is in 1,000 years ago or more, you know, which is, yeah, very, very interesting. But my grandfather is growing up. He's becoming established in his Armenian community, and I have to explain something about the Armenian community. It's a very kind of insular community. And it wasn't just the only one. There were a lot of Greeks. There was a very strong Jewish community in Egypt. And of course, in the 50s, with Israel rise and anti-Semitism, a lot of them left Egypt and went to Israel. So all of those things, all of those small communities started to sort of get smaller and smaller, to where by the time it was my generation, it was maybe about 5,000 Armenians in Egypt.
Wow.
While during my grandfather's time, it was maybe over 100,000.
Yeah.
And during my dad's time, it was maybe in the 50, 60,000 range. So you're constantly kind of looking at all of the infrastructure that is built for Armenians, and it's much larger than it needs to be for the current number of Armenians,
Right.
which is really bizarre. You go to an Armenian school and it's built for 1,000 students, and there's only 150.
Yeah. Well, people in the Christian Reformed Church will understand this in a lot of places, because you go to this massive church, and there's a couple hundred people there, and it's like, why do we have all these pews? Well, it's because 40 years ago these pews were full. Oh, why aren't they full anymore? And that breeds questions. So, but in this case, you've got people basically leaving for greener pastures. They have a sense that, how much of a future do we really have here? Maybe there's a better future in Israel. There's a better future in America. So people are emigrating.
Right. And of course, after the First World War, after the Second World War, when Soviet Russia is really struggling for people and manpower, and millions dead, right? They start to go to the communities in the diaspora of the Armenians and the Latvians and the all the different areas of the sort of Eastern European countries, and saying, guys, come back. Russia's wonderful. USSR is amazing. We will help you. We will provide. And there's a very interesting story of my mom's side of the family deciding to take a chance and going to the USSR. And the deal was, because they knew that they were going to be watched, and all the can't really write freely to each other back and forth and so on, they said, we will send you a photo of us when we settle in Armenia, which is now part of the USSR. And if we're doing well, we will all be standing in the photo. And if we're not doing well, so that you don't come, we will all be sitting in the picture. They get a picture of all of them laying on the floor. And what happened was, what the Russians did, they took all of these immigrants, and they took the men and they took them to the Gulag, and they took them to Siberia, and they had them work on infrastructure and away from their families. And it was an absolute mess. And my mom finally met up with her relatives who had moved to Armenia in the early 2000s, and just the level of poverty and the level of just absolute, just horrible life, of no quality of life, of just being so darn poor all the time, was just very palpable, very, very, very hard to kind of process for my mom and my dad. Yeah.
So is there a sense of sort of global Armenianism, in that there's you've just got people all around the world, but there's kind of a network between them?
Absolutely, there is. And a lot of it's not just Armenian, it's more politically derived. So Armenia as a category is too big. And so you have the connections through the smaller political entity. And that's something that is really interesting about the Armenian community in Egypt. We had one Armenian church, the Armenian Apostolic Church, and that was for the entire community. And then there was a Catholic Armenian church, It was for the Catholic Armenians, much, much smaller community, sub-community. But there was also the clubs, and the clubs were the social gathering place, but those clubs were formed based on political party lines. So my side of the family was part of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation. Okay, so much more closest to conservative, let's say. Okay, wanting Armenian revolutionary federation, wanting Armenian liberation, Armenian freedom, get back our lands, very patriotic, and so on. And then you have two other political factions, one much smaller than the other, but the rival would be a more, let's say, liberal kind of, entity. And what's really interesting about when I kind of came up in the early 80s was that there were a lot of kids who were about 7 to 10 years older than me. And then there was my brother who was 4 years younger than me, and a girl who was 2 years younger than me, and that's it. So I had very few people to play with, growing up. There was maybe one other guy who was a couple of years younger than me as well, but would only come once in a while, so it wasn't like a constant, buddy. So a very small network of friends, and all of the people that were, had stronger community, had a stronger sense of belonging, were, another generation older than me. It was hard for me to obviously connect with them.
So how did you leave Egypt? How did that happen?
Oh wait, before I say that, there's more things that are important in the leaving Egypt. So what happens is I grew up in an environment where we have a shared Armenian school, and in my class there's only 5 people, including me, 2 guys and 3 girls. And the class before me, there's only 3 girls. Now, when we first started in kindergarten, my class was about 9 people, and the class before me was 7. But a lot of these families had started to slowly immigrate successively over into the US and Canada and such.
Yep.
And what happens is, so I was basically what you would consider homeschooled, essentially. We just happened to dress up, in a kind of funny looking navy suit and gray slacks and like a white and blue shirt and a tie, and but it was essentially homeschooling. And we stayed in the same classrooms, and the teachers would rotate. So it's not the American system where you have to leave the classroom to go to someplace else for the other class. The teachers come to you. And this matters in me leaving Egypt. So my earliest sort of religious experiences or relationship with Christianity, let's say, is I show up at school, and we're moving from kindergarten to first grade, and we get to there's a different building. For first grade to high school is a different building, so it's a very big psychological move. And we go to this new building, and everybody runs and races at the beginning of class to go to sit down at their desks, because it's every man for himself, every woman for himself. And we sit down and we get our stuff ready and organized. And I noticed that the girls that, the 2 like really smart girls in class are starting to have all these images on the top of their desk, just laid religious images, Jesus carrying the lamb, the mother and child, all these different images. And I'm like really intrigued. I know what they are. My family isn't particularly religious. My grandfather is very much so in a very simplistic form. But I walk up to this girl and I said, "What's going on with these pictures? What's the deal?" And she goes, "Oh, well, my mom and dad gave this to me, and they said, if you have a hard quiz or a hard question you don't know how to answer, you just look at those images and pray, and God will give you the strength to, do well in school." And I'm first grade. I'm a kid, right? Okay, so I go, "I want that power. I want that juice. I got to get me some of those pictures." So I go home and I said, "Mom, I got to tell you, there's this power, okay, where you get these pictures and then you pray to them, and then you do really well in school. I got to get this." And she gives me some of her stuff that she has, from her sock drawer or whatever. And I look at them and I'm like, "No, this doesn't have the juice. This isn't the real. I want good quality stuff, you could tell. Don't give me an image with a wooden cross on it, or an image with a rock formation. No, give me I want the face of Jesus. I want the angels. I want the whole thing." So we would go to this my mom took me to this Catholic church a couple blocks away from our house, and next to this, there's the church. There's a small little kiosk with a bunch of books and tchotchke stuff, and of course all those little cards, that people keep in their wallets or their pockets or whatever, with usually prayers in the back of them. And I, get a whole set of them. Now I've got like my set of like top 5. And my mom's like, enough. Come on now. And so I lay this out on my table. Now all of us in class are doing this. We got our, and the teachers walk in and they look at all of our tables and they don't say anything, but they're like, man, this is a religious bunch. And then we kept doing this for years until we get to about middle school. And this one guy, Mr. Thomas, he comes into class, and he's not a teacher. He's someone who was a business owner but wanted to try teaching and having fun with his life, kind of thing. So he shows up, he's teaching us Armenian, and he sees all of these images on our desks, and he goes, "What are you guys doing? What is this?" And we tell him, look, we pray to this, and then we have power to do well in school. It works really good. And he goes, "You really think that praying to these pictures is going to make you do well in school?" And honestly, all of us after class, we were concerned for his soul. We were like, this guy's going to hell. This guy's he's a heathen. How dare he? Oh, it was absolutely, amazing. And so another story that's really interesting. So the Armenian school is run by the church. So the bishop comes every year in the beginning of the year, and he sits down and he gives a lecture, and it's always the same lecture. You would expect the guy to say something profound, something really religious, spiritual. No, it's the same picture. He goes, could you imagine a doctor going to see his patients without his medical bag? Could you imagine a soldier going to the military without his gun? Well, likewise, could you imagine you coming to school without your books? Make sure you bring your books. What is this? This is ridiculous. Like by the time I was 7, I'm thinking this is getting old.
Y'all have graduated to the pictures, to game the system, the book stuff. That's you don't have to remind us about that.
So eventually, the other thing that happened, because this is a religious school, shall we say, they would take us on certain holidays, they would take us to the church for services, for something significant happening during the week. And so we would get in the bus, we'd go to church, and we would have the service, and there would be almost nobody there except for this one lady, very frail looking, very petite, very small, very old. And she would be like really into this religious service, and she would have like her scarf on, she would be praying and just really seeking up to God. And my impression of that as a little kid was like, she's weak. Like, she can't handle life. That she needs to do this groveling and this worship to just survive for her day. Like, that's not attractive.
Huh.
That was just my impression of
yeah,
religious fervor equated to weakness of character, or just fortitude, let's say.
Yeah.
And then we would be given communion at the end. And in the Armenian system, right, there's the chalice, and then the guy would take the bread and dip it, and then he would stuff his fingers in your mouth. It's just, amazing. So we would take this bread, and we'd show up to the school bus to go back to school, and somebody looked at me and said, where's the bread? And I said, I ate it. So what do you mean you ate it? He gave you a big piece, didn't he? Yeah. Well, did you chew it? Well, yeah, I chewed it. You chewed the flesh of Jesus? Are you nuts? And we are having this very deep, very serious theological debate about, can you chew the flesh of Jesus or can you not? And I was just really distraught by this. And I was like, okay, so what do? You're supposed to leave it in your mouth until it just dissolves? Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing too, religiously speaking, when you take communion, you're supposed to fast. So you're not supposed to eat anything. And my parents never really wanted to adhere to that rule. But then at some point, when you get old enough and there's peer pressure, you say, did you fast? And you can't lie. You're like, yeah, I definitely fasted. So Mom, I'm not having breakfast. I can't do it. We're getting communion. And you go to church, and of course you're hungry. You haven't eaten for like 14, 15 hours, and you faint. And I've done this several times. to the point where people were concerned about my health as a like, you know, what's wrong with this kid? Like, I fast. I'm taking this seriously. But honestly, Paul, I had no idea who really Jesus was, except
Hmm.
the title Son of God. And I was
Hmm.
like, so what does that even mean? So and you know, I remember having the altar, and then there would be a picture of him on the right side being on a crucifix, and on the left side with the tomb, you know, not a stone rolled away, but an actual tomb on the ground lifted, and then the Roman soldiers in terror, and then him ascending. I'm like, what does that have to do with me? I don't understand. Why are we here? Why are we doing this? And I also remember that the altar was like really holy and really serious, and you don't mess with that place. You don't run around there. You take it very, very seriously. And one day they decided to do foot washing. And in the Armenian church, when you do foot washing, you don't do it for the adults, you do it for the kids.
Hmm.
So the kids are supposed to go up there, sit in the chair, and do their, you know, get their feet washed by the priest, and then you move on. And it's like a wonderful thing. Okay, so first experience doing this, I'm 12 years old. I go up there. I am so nervous because I am in the what they call Holy of Holies. This is a very serious place. You don't really, you know, like I feel like I'm just gonna, you know, ruin something and ruin my life, and it's gonna be awful for me. So I'm really nervous, and I'm acting very nervous, and I'm trying to figure out, what am I supposed to do? Where do I sit? When do I sit? And the priest, who's getting frustrated at me, goes, "What's wrong with you, kid? Are you in Armenian, we use the word bagases, as in like, are you diminished mentally? Is there something wrong with it?" It's a very insulting word. And I'm thinking, we're in the Holy of Holies. You're right in front of the altar. This is where you do the whole communion prayer thing. And you just insulted me in the presence of the Holy of Holies. This is this is unbelievable. So this is my understanding of religion. You know, very superficial,
Yeah.
very much, you know, superstitious,
Yeah.
very much of like, you know, rub the genie and then some
Yeah.
good things will
Yeah.
happen
Yeah.
for you, type
Yeah.
of religion. So that's my understanding of religion. And eventually I go to college, and
Where'd you go to college?
American University in Cairo
Okay.
after high school. And the thing about you know, being by myself and being not having a lot of very close friends and so on, is that you do a lot of people watching. You know, in Egypt, everything is always busy. So everybody lives in apartment buildings, and we live on the third floor. So, you know, sometimes when my brain's fried doing too much schoolwork, you go out to the balcony and you watch people. And it's just fascinating what you see and what you learn. And, you know, especially during like the Adha Eid, where they slaughter the lamb. You know, the Muslims, you know, do the sacrifice and so on. You see like all kinds of like people slaughtering animals right in front of you, right there in the open, and then they would butcher the thing in the front of the building, and then all the poor people would come, and they would hand them bags of the meat, because you're supposed to, part of the deal is you're supposed to give to the poor on that particular day.
Oh,
It's fascinating to grow up watching that. You know, always look forward to that time to like see this happen. And one year, this one house in the corner the guy was really wealthy, so he butchered an actual bull. Like they brought a cow and they butchered the cow, and
in an urban area, out
in
in
the
the
urban area,
open.
right in the open. And then you would take, the culture is that you take the blood of the animal and you would dip your hands in it, and then you would put the handprints on the wall of your house, on your car, on your, you know, just to bless everything. And so you would see like just handprints of blood just
Can you
all over.
imagine doing this? I've been talking in my church. I said, you know, because I'm trying to give an illustration. I said, you know, if I put a pile of rocks
Mhm.
and some fire, and I took like a goat and I killed it right at the corner of Florin Road and Amherst here, I think the city would first cite me and then jail me. I
Yeah,
mean, if I start putting
yeah,
handprints of blood on the church, people would be calling my city council person, say, I don't know what's going on in that place, but you got to send somebody over there and make him stop.
right,
Because, you know,
right. Yeah. So one year, while I'm doing my people watching, you know, I noticed that in the building across from me, there's this really beautiful blonde girl in the balcony, right on my level. Too far for me to actually see what her face looks like, but you know, by the figure I know, yeah, she's pretty. So, you know, always looking forward to seeing this girl, you know, 16, 17 years old, of course. And and eventually, you know, I go to college, and I study engineering at the American University in Cairo, and I do theater. I don't minor in theater. I just take some theater classes and I do some theater stuff because I enjoy theater, did it in school and so on. I was pretty good at it. And I'd get all these like really nice leading roles at the American University in Cairo. And eventually I did a play where my love interest is this girl who is half Norwegian, half Egyptian, and we're getting to know each other, and she's pretty cool, and everybody's really nice, and it's kind of interesting the contrast between my engineering friends and my theater friends. Very different people. A lot more girls in one side than the other.
You better believe it.
And eventually, we discover that we live across the street from each other. And remember that girl that brought across the window? It turns out to be her.
All right.
Now, in that type of environment, in that type of environment that I grew up in, one of the things that in the absence of a religious kind of framework, one of the things that happens is that a relationship with your spouse becomes really important and necessary for surviving. My grandfather and my grandmother's relationship was just really beautiful, and their love story is really nice. And then my mom and my dad's love story is also very, very nice. And everybody, like all my friends, their parents, are like how they met and how, like, who knew who and what the circumstances were. Just, romance was in the air. I don't know if you remember the 1970, there was a famous movie called Love Story. Where Do I Begin song, reminded me a lot. That Where Do I Begin song reminded me a lot of the video you had about, was it Ernest Becker or something like that? Where the relationship between a man and a woman becomes sort of like a deistic relationship where you're looking for your life fulfillment through this person. So I grew up thinking that that's my mission in life, is to find my spouse. And so for a while, I thought it was going to have to be an Armenian girl because that's what my, parents would really like, and my grandparents would love that. And eventually, I start to have this really deep emotional connection with this girl across the street. Problem is, she's Muslim. Her dad's Muslim, so she's Muslim. So her and I can't have a relationship because I would have to be Muslim for me to have a relationship with her.
Right.
And we're getting pretty serious in this relationship to the point where I am seriously considering, it's just something on your passport. Like that, in the Egyptian passport, it says either Christian or Muslim on your passport as part of your identity. Yeah. And so, what's the difference? Egyptian, Muslim, same thing. But I knew the cost. And the cost was that I would probably be disowned by my grandparents, and I would be disowned by my parents. Maybe my parents I could win over time, but definitely my grandparents would not have any of it. Even though my grandfather grew up in sort of the world where, he's doing a lot of work in mosques. At this point, he's getting better and better at his craft. He's traveling all over the Middle East, working on mosques, putting chandeliers up in the mosques and in some churches as well, and in hotels and casinos and so on. I mean, really like impressive work. And all of his employees are Muslim. Some are maybe Coptic Christians, but majority are Muslim. And so you can't really live a life where you say, yeah, Christianity, Jesus, way, truth, and life. No other way to God except through me. You kind of say, well, we're all children. It's all Abrahamic faiths. We're all worshiping the same God. And that's the atmosphere that I grew up in, where you say, we all worship the same God. That's just the reality of it. And so to me, it's like, it's all the same God, right? That's how I grew up. So what difference does it make? And so as things progressed and things got more and more serious, then it became like, well, we have to, we want to get married. How do we do this? And I can't really live in Egypt and get married. So there was an opportunity for me to come to the US as an exchange student. And my mom always wanted that because my mom had lived in the US because her side of the family had immigrated to the US. And part of the deal was that my dad and mom connected after she had moved and then got married, and she moved back. And all of my family relatives on my dad's side and my mom's side, they all lived all over the US. So growing up, I was always visiting the US in the summers. All my summers were spent in either New York or in Florida or in Texas or in San Diego, just all over the place in the US. It was great fun. See my cousins and aunts and uncles and so on. And my mom's parents, my grandparents on my mom's side. So this is my life. I'm living partly in the US, partly in Egypt, and and I'm really popular in school because I come back with all the American candies, and share it with kids. And if I hadn't known any better, because you see a lot of American YouTube channels about being entrepreneurial and kids selling their candy. If I had done that to my Egyptian friends, I would have been the most horrible person, to not be willing to share the candy, but to sell it to them. I would be the most horrible person. And my parents would have been mortified that I'm making money off of my friends. So the culture is so different. Here it's all about make as much as you can, take advantage of whoever you need to take advantage of. There it's buy friends, make friends with the stuff that you have, bless others. So eventually what happens is I have an opportunity to go to the US, and this is perfect. I can go become an exchange student for a year, maybe settle there, get an internship. This would have been my junior year in college, so get an internship, maybe make a life. So I leave in June of 2002 to come to the US, which is a very interesting time because 9/11 had just happened.
Yeah.
And I remember exactly where I was in 9/11. And I was in a theater class. It was around 3 o'clock in the afternoon because of the time change. And all of a sudden we hear massive cheering and yelling outside of the classroom. The American University in Cairo is in downtown Cairo, very near Tahrir Square, where the revolution and stuff, Arab Spring, happened. So I'm hearing all these cheers, all Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, what's going on? And of course, the theater teacher was an American woman, and somebody came in to grab her and let her know what happened, and it's very emotional, of course, for her. And we are terrified. I mean, we're all, considered to the we're not necessarily, a lot of my classmates were Egyptians, Arabs, right, just like, but we're considered, Western to the average, of course, because you're
going to the American University in Cairo.
And so, part of for a split second, we were like, are we in danger? Is this a revolution happening? What's going on? And I called my dad and I'm like, Dad, do I need to figure out how to come home as quickly as possible? Are you going to go home as quickly as possible? And my brain is starting to think, how do I try to go from downtown Cairo to my house without having to depend on main roads and to kind of be incognito more? And he goes, oh, you'll be fine. Don't worry about it. Everything's fine. It's okay. It's not fun what happened. It's not good what happened. It's pretty terrible. We feel terrible, but I think we're safe. Okay, good. But it's an exchange student program. So what's supposed to happen is one person is supposed to come to the American University in Cairo while I go to the US, and that never, the person who was supposed to take my place never did. And thankfully for Penn State, they said, come anyway. It's okay. So that was wonderful. So I come to the US and I stay in New York with my aunt and uncle, my mom's aunt and uncle, from June to about August until school starts. And the thing about New York, and the reason I came early is because I'm trying to get my citizenship, because I have a green card, because my mom is an American, but I can't really become an American. Rule changes that, I have to go through a naturalization process. Eventually, what happens is, again, I'm in a very serious relationship with this girl. I would like to become Muslim. I need to learn something about Islam. I mean, I can't just be like, whatever, I'll sign whatever. So I got to learn stuff, and I buy these books, and I go to in Jamaica, New York, which is right next to Queens. There's a very big Islamic area. I don't know if you've been there, but it feels like a little Cairo. It's crazy. Walk in there to Islamic kind of bookstore type of thing, and I buy a couple of things. I buy Quran, and I'm reading through it, and I'm terrified. Absolutely terrified. And there's a small voice in me that says, you know nothing about Christianity, and you're learning all this reading about Islam. Maybe, just to be fair, you ought to just learn a little bit about Christianity. Yeah, that sounds reasonable. So I go to Fifth Avenue to Barnes & Noble, the biggest Barnes & Noble in the country, and I'm expecting to just go to the Bible section and pick one up and leave. Should take 30 seconds. I get to the Bible section. It's the length of a stinking football field.
Yeah.
How are there so many Bibles? Different Bibles, different widths and sizes and dimensions. How is this possible?
And not so the Quran. There's just supposed to be just one.
Right. I literally spent 4 hours looking through everyone, and I'm going through like, this is too much information. Process of elimination. Get the biggest thing you can, because you want to make sure everything is in it. You don't want any Bibles missing half the, the good stuff or whatever. So I walk out of there with like a big hunk of Bible, and it's an Aramaic Bible. It's like translated from the language Jesus spoke. It says, I still have that copy. It's a horrible translation, but it's, still. All right, fine. I'm reading through this, and of course I do what everybody does, start at Genesis. And I am not understanding this at all. What is going on with people getting raped and people killing everybody, and God saying, get rid of them and eliminate them? And what is this? Where is the good Christians that like I grew up with and all the nice stuff? So I'm super confused at this point, and I eventually make it to Penn State, and I'm going to the dorms, and right by the food court area, there's a table outside, a raffle table. There's an American football, some Penn State shirts, a boombox. I wanted the American football. I was like, I need an American football. So I go to the thing. I say, what do I have to do to win this American football thing? And they're like, oh, fill the survey. It's a raffle. Oh, perfect. So I fill this out, and it says, would you like to discuss with a group of people the Bible? I said, yeah, this actually is amazing. Finally, somebody to help me understand
what stuff.
And so I fill this thing out, and I don't put my phone number. I only put my email. And a few days later, I get an email that says, unfortunately, you did not win anything, but you did say you were interested in talking about the Bible. Would you be willing to meet in a group and so on? And I emailed back and I said, I don't really want to meet in a group. I want to meet one-on-one with somebody. But I want to make sure that I can ask questions, because I'm really, like, I don't want to be lectured at. I want to be able to ask questions. So if you're willing to have me ask questions, then let's talk. So I sit down, I meet somebody at this particular location. Now, my name is Asho Tumayans. I'm sticking to my real original name in the beginning of me coming to the US. My name is Asho Tumayans, and I am going to stick with it. I'm not changing it for anybody. Now, this guy is expecting to see a Middle Eastern looking guy, somebody foreign, like not a regular old white vanilla dude, right? So I sit there at the chair where we're supposed to meet, and I see this guy who really looks like he's looking for somebody. He's wearing like regular jeans and a Penn State sweater, and I'm thinking, this guy's gonna tell me about God? Where's the clothes? Where's the dignity? Like where's the collar, man? Like what is this? Who are you to tell me about God? So finally, I'm like, you looking for Asho Tumayans? Yes, that's me. And he gets upset with me. Like, he looks at me like, I've been walking around you for 15 minutes. I'm like, yeah, I was trying to figure out if like, tell me about God. So we meet for like several weeks, and I'm just peppering him with all kinds of, questions. And my big questions are, okay, help me understand this. Christianity, Islam, is it all one God? Is it not? What's going on here? And what about the poor 5-year-old kid in Saudi Arabia who dies not hearing the so-called gospel of yours? What about his fate? What's going on with this whole like American Christianity versus Armenian Christianity? I mean, is there going to be like different sections of countries in heaven? Because it's like the Armenian church, we're part of the Armenian church, and I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, we're just gonna have like an Armenian quarter in heaven? Is that what it is? Or is so I have all these weird questions, and he very patiently goes through and tries to answer them. Meanwhile, I'm still reading about Islam. I'm trying to understand it. I'm talking with my girlfriend on a daily basis, and things are going great until about October. I get the phone call where she says, maybe this thing isn't going to work out anymore. I was changing my whole life for you, willing to like heaven and earth, like get disowned by my own family, changing my religion, and you just think, we're good. This is crazy. This is insanity. And it wasn't like I was ignoring her or I was like posting pictures with there was nothing to post back then. Facebook hadn't been invented till 2004. But there was nothing like I'm not responding to her or anything like that. Very attentive, very loving, very kind. But just, man, we're good. We're done. So that really threw me for a tizzy for a while. For a whole month, I'm like, I'm just confused. I'm so confused. Here I am, just absolutely willing to give my life, just literally give my life to this person, you know. Um, and she was just willing to just say,
Nah.
no, thanks. So it's just bizarre, just absolutely bizarre, so confused. Um, and I think it was during that time where eventually Dave Hatfield, the guy who was reaching out to me, he was the campus pastor of a particular church group. He eventually said, I spent a lot of time answering your questions, but I think it would be helpful if we start actually going through the Bible and looking at some verses so you can see it straight from the Bible and you can do your own reading
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
So he sits down with me and he, I surrender to that and we go through the Bible study and he goes through all these scriptures about God so loved the world that he gave his only son and I've never heard John 3:16. And I know for a lot of like even nominal Christians or deconstructed Christians, that sounds really weird. How are you raised as a Christian? Took religion classes in Arabic because you had to take religion as part of the Egyptian educational curriculum. Took religion classes in Arabic and Armenian and never heard of John 3:16 before. But it's the culture. It's a different kind of format where you say, well, you're part of the church. You were baptized. You're in. You're good. There's nothing to worry about anymore. I mean, just be a good person. Be moral. I knew a lot of the parables, the prodigal son, all those things, but it was a very moralistic sort of teaching as opposed to what's the spiritual significance. Um, Almost very little about the Old Testament. Almost knew nothing about the Old Testament at all. We'd read about Daniel and prophecies about Jesus, Jeremiah, and Moses talking about how I want everybody to prophesy, and just no connection. I don't get any of this. I don't understand why this matters. Why is this important? Why do I need to give it any attention? Um, but after this breakup, a lot of these verses that he would kind of read and I would read and they would just go over my head, a lot of them started to sound different. A lot of them started to kind of make me realize that there is a God who loves me personally, not just humanity. There's a God who has a personal vested interest in what becomes of me. And I thought that's interesting. And it finally clicked one day that this adoration, this love that I had for this person was the kind of adoration and love that no human could hold, that she couldn't handle it. And it wasn't because there was anything wrong with that person. It's just that a human is not meant to hold this devotion, this level of self-sacrifice and this absolute, I mean, let's be honest. I leave Egypt. I come to the US. I'm in a university in the US. Let me tell you, the women in the US are a lot prettier than women in the Middle East. I'm sorry. It's just, and
A lot more women watching this from the US than the Middle East, so I think we're safe.
All right, good. And so it's very natural. I mean, a lot of Middle Eastern men go through this, by the way, and this happens in Europe too, right? It's very natural. I mean, unfortunately, the assumption is that Western women are easier.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the reason why there's a lot of all this mess happening from, Eastern men coming to the West, is they assume that like I should just be able to like I want and be given,
Yeah.
And I never really was even tempted by any of the beauty that I saw or any of the I was like I know my one, and I'm dedicated to this one. And to just kind of all of that to just be dismissed was weird and really strange. And eventually what happened was I finally realized that the love that I had for this human being was meant to God, that it wasn't meant for another human being, that my fulfillment, my sense of my desire to be fulfilled in myself, my desire to feel like I am home, was to be met in not just a person, a human being person, but the creator of all. And the wonder of that creator being willing to condescend himself to become flesh for our sake, to bear our burdens, to suffer with us and for us, and to pay the price of our inability to ascend to God. And I always, when I was in high school, I had this sense of like, there has to be a God. I mean, I read Descartes and I read some philosophy stuff with Plato and so on. And I had this sense early on that there has to be a God. But the problem was like, which God and who God and what God and how God. And it just felt impossible to try to climb up to this God. And I remember having these really simple, innocent prayers of like, God, if there's a God, if you're real, I'd like to kind of know who exactly. And especially while I'm going through this whole Islam, Christianity, and so on, I'm like, am I doing the right thing? Am I, there's this slight doubt in me of like, yeah, I'm willing to do this, but is this the right thing to do? Right in its own sake, not just right for my well-being or what have you.
Right.
And eventually I decided, you know what? I think I need to give my life to God. And I don't say that in an evangelistic kind of like come to the altar sense. I've never been to a church, by the way. Never been to an American church at this point. This is only strictly through meeting with the one guy and reading the Bible and having this event happen. And an event I need to give my life. I need to live life dedicated to this being and to worship him above all else and to hold him as the highest thing that I can serve in my life. And that from that, he is worthy. And the very first thing that I had to deal with was, what about Turkish people? Because it was a badge of honor to hate Turkey, to hate everything about Turkey, everything that's Turkish, everyone
that becomes the identity.
That is part of your identity. And very quickly, it was like, it's not possible. I can't do that. If he was willing to forgive me, how can I? And if a Turkish man were to say, I want Jesus, how can I be like, pay back what you did to the Armenians? Why is that person responsible for what happened to the Armenians? And why does he have to pay? And all these questions came to the surface. So there's a very long process of having to go through that forgiveness and understand that I can't, there's no room for me holding a personal grudge or having a badge of honor in my hatred to someone else for just having to be of a particular ethnicity. And that was a very serious and heavy thing because, we grew up with like, if we saw anything in the market made in Turkey, we knew not to touch it. Wow. You never touch anything made in Turkey. You never go. There was a story of my grandmother going on a cruise ship around the Mediterranean and with her friends and such. And my grandfather, of course, doesn't do those things. And she comes back and she's like, oh, it was wonderful. We stopped at Istanbul. You stopped where? Istanbul. You got off the ship? Yeah. How could you? Oh, we got all these. Look at this leather jacket we got. Istanbul is known for its leather goods. We got all these leather jackets. He burned those leather jackets. He literally lit a match to them. He's like, there's no way. There is no way I'm taking this stuff. So our concept as Armenians, our concept of an evangelist is someone who goes around and tries to convince other governments and other communities about the Armenian genocide and about the truth of the Armenian genocide. That is like when someone would visit our community from all around the different, that's the person that, that's the person that's the ideal that you aspire to be, that if you were intellectually kind of sharp enough, maybe one day you can be that.
That's the cause.
That is the cause. That is the meaning, is to finally have the community acknowledge the Armenian genocide.
That's that Corey ten Boom moment. Have you ever heard of The Hiding Place? The end of the book. I've read it in some of my videos where where her sister was killed by the Nazis, and and it's not just a Nazi prison guard. It's the Nazi prison guard she remembered from her meeting, comes up at one of her crusades
Yep.
and talks about the love of Jesus even for him. And she's like, right there, right there, there it is. You killed my sister. I mean,
No,
it's not my ancestors, it's my sister. And,
yeah.
and I in front of me. I mean, it's you can't get more personal or powerful than that. Wow. Wow.
Now, this happened about 22 years ago now. It's been 22 years. And for many years, I would not share this story of my conversion experience. And whenever I would be talking to somebody about Christianity and about serving God and loving God and evangelizing to them, let's say, it was never, I rejected that way of talking, that relational aspect, the sense of like love and devotion and so on, because it just sounded too emotional, too relational. I was constantly more attracted to the more rational, the more it's just self-evident. It's Romans 1 type of thing. The idea that there are things that you have to acknowledge about creation, about the world, and you're rejecting them, and that rejection is there's going to be consequences to that rejection, but you need to accept who God is. And the thing that I've learned over the years, as there have been more distance from that experience to today, because if it was like a year ago, 6 months ago, it would have been like, I'll give it 6 months, he'll move on,
Yeah.
But it's 22 years, and it's pretty powerfully sustaining. And if we're going to talk about like, well, what happened over the last 22 years, that's a whole nother hour, but I'm not going to get into that. But the thing is, it's not like some emotional kind of high, and we've been living off of that. There's a lot that has happened. There's a whole history over the last 22 years of walking with God and experiencing disappointment and experiencing awful things, and still choosing to say, but God, and wanting to continue to serve Him above all else. And you don't do that just because you rationally assent to an idea. You do that because there's a fidelity that you have to a person, that God became flesh, and that you have a relationship with that flesh. And sometimes when you say like God is not a super thing in the sky, part of me's like, I agree with you, but he sort of is too.
Yeah, that's the one, number one and number two. He sort of is too. That's right.
And the thing is that this, in a very kind of rationalistic sense of trying to reason towards God, one thing that's really important is to understand that like, there is a falling in love aspect to having a relationship with God. And I think we need to go back to that. We need to somehow include that in the vocabulary, as opposed to just making the case from a, this way of living, this worldview isn't really going to pay off. So therefore try this worldview, because it's like, it's the best story. It's like, what do you mean? What do you mean it's the best story? It's the creator of heaven and earth, the Godhead, that terrifying being, the being who is all light, the being who would consume you in an instant, wants to have a relationship with you, and your answer is it's a good story? No, if it's not for relationship, then what is it for? And my concern is that a lot of people are trying different Christianities, let's say, for their immersive experience, or a worldview, the bells and the smells and the aspects of Christianity that I grew up with. I said it wasn't salvific. There was nothing that saved me with that. I participated in the worship services. I went to them. I didn't understand anything that was said. It was done in old Armenian, sort of like people liking the Latin Mass. It's like, if you know Latin, great. But if you don't know Latin, why do you like the Latin Mass? um, and instead, you have someone who said, hey, God loves you, and God wants to have a relationship with you. And he went through all this trouble so that you and him can walk together. And, things are probably going to work out okay for you. You live in the US after all. but you're probably also going to go through some hell. And the question is, are you still going to continue to walk with him while you go through that hell?
Yeah.
And one thing I've learned from you is that, you know, for the longest time, my attitude of I will walk through you, I will walk with you through hell was sort of like a grit my teeth and make my head like flint sort of attitude.
Yeah.
But I think you were the one who kind of highlighted and kept highlighting. I think it's a reformed aspect. I think that it's a gift. Your ability to walk with him is a gift.
That's right. That's right. It's all.
And
It's all gift.
and even my ability to say that I need to worship this God. I need to submit to this God. I need to give him my all. That wasn't some rational faculty of mine that ascended to that level of, you know, incredible smarts. That's a gift.
Just look at your story. I mean, you've got the most amazing story. I mean, just generations on down, and you can find this Muslim girl, and you're gonna convert, and you're gonna go to America, and you want a football. It's gift. It's gift.
It's all a gift. And you know, and the thing is, like, I'm reading through The Sacrifice of Praise by Herman Bavinck. Yeah, and I've been like really diving into some Dutch guys. You know, Bavinck is like a personal hero of mine right now. I love that guy. We went through with a friend of mine, we went through The Wonderful Works of God, which amazing experience. But you know, in the sacrifice of praise, he makes this comment that whenever the word of God is spoken, it is not just like, it didn't work. It's never null and void. It's going to accomplish the task that it's meant to accomplish. It's either going to lead someone to become alive again, to rise from the dead, literally, or it's going to harden someone. Those are the two options. It's either going to harden you or it's going to soften you to him. That's it. So this notion that, like, you know, I don't want to talk biblical language. I don't want to say the word of God. No, we have to say the word of God, because it's the only thing. It is the only thing that is able to separate, right? It's the only thing that can divide, and it's the only thing that can help people either move towards him or harden them further. And maybe people need to go through some hardening before they can be softened. Maybe there is that level of hardening that is necessary before you finally can surrender.
Well, the irony of hardening is that it also makes people fragile and brittle.
Yes.
And it's the broken heart that, you know, it's the broken and contrite heart that God looks to. I mean, you see it again and again in the Psalms. It's the contrite heart. I mean, contrite is, you know, it's broken. It's I no longer have my own resources in order to somehow willfully try to make myself. No. It's all gift. It's gift.
Yeah.
It's the broken
You know,
and contrite heart that he
and I have
welcomes.
one comment I want to make. Recently, you had a video where you talked about, you know, parents. I have a wonderful wife, and we have 5 children together.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Three girls and 2 boys, and they're just wonderful. And you know, you made a comment a few videos ago about you know, this idea that we can raise children and fashion them and form them into whatever we want them to be.
Yeah.
And that, you know, don't think that's too easy because the culture is very powerful.
Yeah.
You know, I understand that sort of pragmatic way of thinking, that, you know, culture is important. But my thing is, like, the Bible talks about children are arrows, you know. The children are arrows that we get to release. And I've been learning about covenant theology, and there is something to a covenantal relationship that we have with God, and that he has that relationship not just with us individually, but with our offspring.
Yeah.
And there's something about, I think part of the reason why I'm a Christian today is because of my grandfather's faith.
Yeah.
And you know, I hope one day you get to taste grandfatherhood.
I hope so too.
Um, and I think if you look at if Barna, I don't know if Barna even does this kind of research or analysis, but if you look at the number of children that leave the faith, my question is, what about their grandparents? Did they live near? Were they believers?
Yeah.
Were they close? Because I guarantee you, if the grandparents were believers and the children were believers, I think the percentages are quite astronomically high that the grandchildren would be believers, regardless of the culture.
I think
Because you
there's
make your own culture.
I think
When you
there's I
have,
think there's a lot of truth to that. But here's an irony that I know from the Christian Reformed Church. We definitely want to be faithful in passing down our faith to our children. And for that reason, the Christian Reformed Church, or Christian Reformed schools, I mean, we practice the whole, create the bubble, create the community. We practice that. Our doctrine is also this story of faith seemingly sometimes coming out of nowhere.
sure.
And it's never out of nowhere, but it is, in other words, we don't want the catechesis of our children to become idolatrous, because that undermines the very thing we're trying to give to our children, which is in fact that this faith is a gift. Now, I appreciate the fact that there's some tension within that in terms of sort of the logic of covenant, but it's also the case that you yourself as a parent can't quicken the hearts of your children.
Absolutely.
And so it's that tension that I point to.
Yes.
And what's interesting is that, I think you rightly look back to the faith of your grandfather, but your grandfather probably couldn't imagine the shape of your faith now. It's the same faith, it's the same Christ, it's the same gospel, but when he would look at the elements of this and say, I could not have planned that for you. In
Of
other
course.
words, Christ had a different path for you to take, and that will probably be true of your children too. And
Oh,
yeah,
I have no doubt. I have no
yeah.
doubt. But I agree with you, and I think one of the things that I have seen just watching you and John Van Donk and so on, the part of the Estuary Leader Network group that I'm part of, there's a couple of people that are Dutch Reformed, and I'm struck by how similar sort of that older generation is to sort of the Armenian culture, where there's a sense of your Dutchness that's really strong, and
Yeah.
I imagine that your children don't feel quite as Dutch as you do, perhaps.
No.
And I think I think, could that be part of the reason why things are disintegrating, so to speak, not just like faith wise, but also in a sense of identity, that the American identity is sort of swallowing up the Dutchness, and
Oh,
therefore
yes.
Christian
And
Reform aspect of the identity.
yeah, and we actually talk about this in our pastors group. We just did our last pastors group meeting too, because part of the irony is that in the 70s, there's this whole movement to burn the wooden shoes. There's a very famous banner editorial about burning the wooden shoes.
Yeah, I've heard
And
you
they
say
were
it.
that was sort of the progressive element of the Christian Reformed Church. Now it's that element that is saying, well, what about our children? And it's like the relationship. I mean, I think there's real resonance here in terms of the Armenian question for you, in that there's both with just about everything that God gives us. It's like the serpent. It's like the serpent in the book of Numbers. God gives us something for our good, and we turn it into an idol. And so on one hand, the Dutchness is a gift of God's grace through culture, through generations of culture, but also that Dutchness can become an idol.
Yes.
And there's always those tensions with the good things that God gives us. And
Yes.
to me, in the Reformed faith, that always means receive God's good gifts with gratitude, but take care that they, and the Bible talks about this often, that, Lord, give me enough bread that I might not be hungry and, might not have to beg, but don't give me too much that suddenly the bread itself becomes where my heart rests instead
Sure.
of resting on you alone. Because you're right, it is the Christian has open hands, because we know that as human beings, and the story, this multi-generational story that you told today, we can't secure our life. I mean, yeah, I certainly agree with you that I hope that the United States is more stable and affords the kind of freedom that we certainly enjoy as religious minorities in a big country like this. And we've seen that disappear in other places of the world. But at the same time, it's always the gift of salvation is always God's gift flowing down to us. He mediates it through, looking for a football and a visa and all these kind of strange things, but it's always gift. And when we, in a sense, when we got to be careful about wielding it, because
Yeah.
then I mean, we're just so prone to idolatry all the time. It's just instinctive in our hearts. So anyway.
Yes. Yes. No, I hear everything you're saying, but I think that I think one of the, if we're talking about meaning crisis and we're talking about this idea that people are struggling to find identity and to find who they are, I think an aspect of the meaning crisis that's important to address is your identity as where God has placed you and in what land you reside.
Yeah.
One of the things that I have
Well, you've got
studied
a
in.
picture of George Washington over your shoulder now. That people aren't going to miss that.
Well, I have a fun story about that. So we're back to Egypt again. I'm in middle school learning history, and I've always been fascinated about history. But in the Egyptian educational system, you kind of do the same history every year, but just with a little bit more detail as you get up in years. And every time it was like ancient Egyptian, and then Islamic, and then the Islamic world, and then Napoleon Bonaparte, and Britain and Europe, and Russia, and World War I, World War II, and modern times. And I'm like, teacher, when do we talk about America and what happened on that side of the continent? And he goes, America? You want to talk about America? We don't talk about babies in this class. We talk about civilizations that go back for thousands of years, not some 250-year-old country. And I'm, now this is a Middle Eastern culture, so you don't really talk back to teachers, but in my head, instantaneously, I was thinking, those Americans managed to do more in 250 years than we've managed to do in a couple thousand.
A couple thousand. Egypt. I mean, Egypt was old when Moses was there.
Right. But my point is that, like, there's a lot of interesting stuff about that desire to, the Neil, the guy you were talking to, the Randos conversation from a couple ones ago, where he talks about society is for law and order and community is for caring.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I struggle with is what's my responsibility as a Christian to shape society, to be responsible for society, as opposed to just passively sitting and accepting whoever decides what society ought to be. And I think there's a lot of movement in the American Christianity that is very suspicious of any talk about having any voice within society. And I think that's a mistake. I think we have the right, we should have impact on society, the law and order part of society, not just the care for one another, community aspect.
Yeah,
So
I'd agree. Well, I'm about at my 2-hour mark here, Ash. I hope this was, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to get in, but you're a great storyteller, and I really hope more people from the corner kind of seek you out. And sometimes what happens when we do something like this is that you become the hot girl for a minute, and the other Randos conversation, the other channels want to talk to you. It certainly happened to Raj here in Sacramento. He was the hot girl for a minute, but
I have maybe two more things that I'd like to talk in just 2 minutes, if I may.
Okay, sure.
One of the things that one of the books that I found several years ago is Henry Clay Trumbull, Threshold Covenant.
Huh.
and he started a Sunday school movement apparently, or something like that. He's pretty big deal in the Philadelphia 1800s type of guy.
Threshold covenant.
Yes.
I never heard of it.
Really? Okay.
Huh.
Well, one of the things that he talks about in this book is that you had this reminded me of your prep for Sunday sermon about the tabernacle and presence of God being in the tabernacle. But one thing that is not really talked about a lot, and I'm mentioning this to you because of Kenneth Bailey and how you introduced me to Kenneth Bailey and how he talks about the Middle East, seeing Jesus through Middle Eastern eyes, and one thing that is interesting about this threshold covenant is that he talks about how in almost every human society, every old human society, their worship of the deity or the boundaries of the deity that they worship started at the threshold. That it was like, from this line in, he is our God. And so you have the statue of the God or the deity in your house, and he would protect the boundaries of your land, of your stuff. Even Nebuchadnezzar, Nebo, protector of the boundary.
Very interesting.
Right.
Wow.
And he talks about how even like in the and I know we're celebrating the birth of Jesus, not the Passover, but in the Passover, he points out how interesting it is that God never gave instruction. Moses never gave any instruction as to where to do the slaughtering of the animal.
Right.
But he said
where to put the blood was very specific.
Where to put the blood is the top and the sides, but the actual slaughtering that happened was on the threshold, because that's where everybody slaughtered their animals, was at the threshold of the temple or the house or wherever you made the sacrifice, was at the threshold.
I never knew that.
Yes, and the cup that would be formed to dip your, the hyssop or whatever it's called, to do that cup would have been dug in the dirt of the threshold, not like bring a bowl here under the neck of the animal. And so where you would pool the blood. And the thing is, when he talks about Passover, a lot of the messages I've heard, Passover is described as like, God sparing that house, like passing over it.
Yeah.
But like, no, Passover is passing over the threshold and being in the house. And he says, when you look at how Jesus talks about, I am the door, anyone who comes through me will live. And he talks about how he says, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone will open the door, I will come in and be with you. He's referring back to the Passover, where God, the Godhead, will come and live with you.
Interesting. I'd never heard of any of this. This is fascinating.
And so the reason I'm bringing it up to you is because I'm like, why aren't more people talking about this? And is this guy really off his rocker?
I'd never heard of this.
To me.
I'd never heard of any of this. This is fascinating.
Yeah.
The book has probably been out a while, huh? I mean, it's an older
1880 something. Yeah. 1896. Published in Edinburgh.
It'll probably be in public domain.
Absolutely. But anyway, so my point is this. It's the season of Christmas, and I'm reading through this small book of Charles Spurgeon, who famously never really celebrated much of Christmas, but he did do a lot of sermons around Christmas. And there's a section, if I may, I'd like to kind of close with this, where he talks to us about who this Jesus is. And I think it's an apt sort of ending for what I've been talking about. And he says, "Oh man, God comes to you in the form of one like yourself. Do not be afraid to draw near to the gentle Jesus. Do not imagine that you need to be prepared for an audience with him, or that you must have the intercession of a saint or the intervention of a priest or minister. Anyone could have come to the babe in Bethlehem. The horned oxen, methinks, ate of the hay on which he slept, and feared not. It is the terror of the Godhead which oftentimes keeps the sinner away from reconciliation. But see, the Godhead is graciously concealed in that little babe who needed to be wrapped in swaddling bands like any other newborn child who feareth to approach him. Yet is the Godhead there. My soul, when thou canst not for very amazement stand on the sea of glass mingled with fire, when the divine glory is like a consuming fire to thy spirit, and the sacred majesty of heaven is altogether overpowering to thee, then come thou to this babe and say, yet God is here, and here can I meet him in the person of this dear Son, in whom dwelleth all the fullness of the Godhead bodily. Oh, what bliss there is in the incarnation of Christ, as we remember that therein God's omnipotence cometh down to man's feebleness, and infinite majesty stoops to man's infirmity.
Beautiful.
Please, please, a lot of people are comfortable with the label agnostic. And you cannot stand before the Godhead of the universe and just nonchalantly, in a very blasé sense, say, I'm agnostic. He came to be with you. He wants to sup with you. He wants to have fellowship with you.
He wants to come over the threshold.
He wants to come over the threshold. He wants to live in your heart. He wants you to live in him. And that is how we become alive. That is how we find our meaning.
Amen. Amen. That's
Thank you,
great.
Paul.
That's a great way to end, Tash. That's a great way to end. Thank you for being so persistent. You've been persistent for a while, I know.
It's a good time to do it, though, with the wonderful season to remember the gift that has come to us.
If people want to get in touch with you, Twitter, or what's the best way?
Yeah, Twitter's fine. I'm not very active on Twitter. I try to not do a lot of social media stuff, but yeah, Twitter is probably an easy way to get for people to get a hold of me. But I don't know how are you still recording?
I can stop.
Well, yeah, why don't you stop real quick, because I would
Okay.
like to do something else.